The morning smelled like fresh coffee and roses, the sunlight slipping through the lace curtains just the way my grandmother used to like it. I had butterflies, not from nerves, but from the excitement of finally marrying the love of my life. My cousin Daniel had promised to take care of everything while I got ready. I trusted him completely. I really did. If you stick around, I'll show you just how quickly trust can turn into regret. From the moment I handed him the wedding checklist, I felt a quiet pride, like passing a baton to someone I believed could carry it without stumbling. He smiled, nodded, and even joked about how easy it would be. The florist had been confirmed. The photographer knew the schedule. The caterer already delivered a tasting menu that smelled of roasted garlic and caramelized onions. Everything was perfect, or at least I thought it was. By noon, I was putting on my dress in the sunlit bedroom, the fabric soft against my skin, the scent of lavender from the bouquet filling the room. Daniel came in with a grin, holding a clipboard and a phone. "Everything's set," he said, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of something I didn't recognize at first. I chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters. The first small sign appeared when the photographer called me asking about a different venue. My heart skipped. I had triple-checked that detail. I texted Daniel, expecting reassurance. His reply was casual, almost dismissive. "Don't worry about it, I've got this." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to. But even then, there was that tiny whisper of doubt threading through my mind. I remember the smell of wax from the candles being set on the tables downstairs. Daniel was overseeing everything, moving swiftly, talking to the staff, laughing like nothing could go wrong. I wanted to breathe in that laughter and feel safe. And for a while, I did. Until the first real mistake hit. The wedding rings weren't where they were supposed to be. Not just misplaced, gone. I felt a jolt of panic, my pulse hammering like a drum in my ears. I called Daniel, my voice tight. "Where are the rings?" He sounded calm, almost too calm. "Relax, I'll find them." But when the ceremony time came, they still hadn't appeared. That's when the whispers started. My aunt noticing the florist wasn't where she'd been scheduled, the caterer scrambling to adjust an order, and my guests looking around like something was off. I remember the scent of burnt sugar from the rushed dessert being set on tables, mingling with the flowers, an aroma that would forever remind me of the chaos. And in that moment, as I stood there in my dress, feeling every eye on me, I realized something devastating. The person I had trusted most on that day was the very reason everything was falling apart. Daniel wasn't just careless. He had made a choice that betrayed my trust in a way that couldn't be undone. The moment I realized Daniel's betrayal, it hit me like a cold gust through an open window. The wedding hall smelled of wax and spilled wine, the laughter of guests now carrying a strange edge of confusion. I remember gripping my bouquet, the petals soft under my fingers, and feeling that hollow twist in my chest, the one that tells you someone you trusted isn't who you thought they were. It started small. The seating chart he'd promised to perfect was a disaster. Cousins who didn't speak were shoved next to each other, and my uncle ended up with the seat meant for my best man. The caterer was in a panic over missing appetizers, and the photographer's assistant kept muttering about changes I wasn't told about. Each little mistake was a whisper of something bigger, a puzzle where the pieces were intentionally hidden. I found Daniel near the dessert table, laughing a little too freely, the phone clutched in his hand like a shield. "Everything's fine," he said, but I could hear the tension in his voice, the just beneath the surface smirk that told me he was enjoying the chaos more than he should. My heart sank. How could someone betray a family member on their wedding day? Especially someone I'd known since we were kids, building forts and sharing secrets. Then came the confrontation. The rings which he'd promised were safely tucked away were missing. Not lost, not forgotten, stolen, it became painfully clear. I demanded an explanation, and instead of remorse, he gave me excuses dripping with jealousy. Apparently, he thought the spotlight of my wedding was too much for him, that my happiness somehow diminished his own. His words were like thorns, sharp and twisting, leaving a sting I knew would last far beyond that day. The guests were starting to notice the tension. My father's face was a mixture of disbelief and silent fury. my mother's hands trembling as she tried to calm the caterer, the florist, everyone. I wanted to scream, to expose Daniel in front of everyone, but something inside me, maybe the remnants of childhood loyalty, held me back. I realized then that some betrayals are not just about what's lost, but about the impossible choice between family and justice. By the time the ceremony started, the air was thick, not with the scent of roses, but with awkward tension, murmurs, and the faint tang of burnt sugar from the rushed desserts. I walked down the aisle holding my partner's hand, feeling the weight of what had been stolen. Not rings, not seating, but the sacred trust I had placed in my cousin. Each step was a mix of sorrow and determination. I wanted the day to be beautiful, to shine through the cracks, but I knew it would never feel the same again. Even now I can smell that room, taste the bitter mix of candle wax and panic, and hear Daniel's forced laughter echoing in my memory. And I think, betrayal has a sound, a scent, a texture. It lives in the little moments you can never unsee or unsmell. My wedding was a celebration, yes, but it was also the day I learned that even blood can be tainted by selfishness. By the time the reception began, the tension in the air had settled into a heavy, almost tangible weight. I could hear the low hum of conversation, but it wasn't light chatter. There was an edge, a quiet curiosity from the guests who had already sensed that something wasn't right. I remember the smell of burnt sugar from the desserts mixing with the faint scent of gardenias, creating a memory I knew would linger for years. Every time I think of that day, it comes back like a photograph burned into my mind. Daniel was nowhere to be found during the first dances. When I finally spotted him, he was in the corner, leaning against a pillar, scrolling on his phone with that same careless smirk. The photos I had hired the photographer for, the ones meant to capture every laugh and tear, were missing frames, cropped badly, or blurred in ways that could only have been deliberate. I felt my stomach twist, the kind of knot that speaks louder than words, and I realized that this was no accident. Daniel had orchestrated chaos as though he were writing some private play where he was the unseen villain. Then came the dinner. Platters were arriving late, some dishes cold, some missing entirely. My mother's eyes were wet, my father's jaw tight as he whispered under his breath, barely audible, "I can't believe this." Guests were polite, but the confusion was evident. One of my best friends leaned in, whispering, "Is he always like this?" I could only shake my head. Daniel wasn't like this. He had been someone I could rely on, someone I thought I knew, someone who had shared my childhood. But by this night I understood that trust, once broken, leaves a silence far louder than words. The real blow came when the officiant asked for the rings. I froze. My hand went to my pocket, and then to my other, and my heart sank. The rings weren't there. A murmur ran through the guests. My cousin, standing off to the side, finally looked up. The smirk was gone, replaced by an expression that was almost triumphant. I couldn't read him. My partner's eyes were wide, a mixture of disbelief and hurt, and I felt my own betrayal reflected back at me in their gaze. This was the culmination of weeks of planning, love, and care, undone in a heartbeat. I demanded the rings from Daniel, my voice shaking, but controlled enough to keep the scene from erupting completely. He shrugged, almost casually, and muttered something about not realizing how important it was. That was the first lie. The next came when he claimed he had left them in a secure place. But the more he spoke, the more I realized that every excuse was a thread pulled from a cloak of jealousy and ego. He wanted attention, and if the cost was my humiliation and the disruption of my wedding, it didn't matter to him. The betrayal wasn't financial or even physical. It was emotional, and that cut deeper than I could have imagined. By the time the night ended, the celebration had turned into a kind of subdued vigil. Guests whispered and speculated, some avoiding eye contact with me, unsure where their loyalty should lie. My family, the people who were supposed to support me, were fractured. Daniel had succeeded in twisting the narrative, leaving everyone questioning choices, motives, and allegiances. I remember the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as people left, the clinking of glasses echoing in the nearly empty hall, and the sharp, metallic scent of spilled wine. It all felt surreal, like walking through someone else's nightmare while being painfully aware it was mine. And yet, Amidst the chaos, there were moments of clarity. My partner reached for my hand, the warmth of their grip reminding me that trust could still exist, even if it had been violated in other ways. The small, quiet smiles from a few friends who saw the truth offered a sliver of solace. I realized then that betrayal doesn't define the entire story. It shapes it, yes, but it doesn't determine the people who endure it. It teaches lessons about the fragility of trust, about the hidden layers of those we love, and about the strength required to move forward without resentment consuming us entirely. That night, lying awake in the dim light of the hotel room, I replayed every interaction, every misstep, every whisper of doubt. I could still smell the mingling scents of flowers and burnt sugar, hear the laughter that had become a memory tinged with bitterness, and feel the touch of hands that had steadied me when everything else faltered. I understood in a painful way that Daniel's actions weren't just about selfishness. They were about fear, envy, and the strange human need to assert control over moments that belong to others. The lesson was raw and unforgettable. Even family, even those closest to us, can harbor darkness, sometimes without ever realizing the devastation they leave in their wake. By the end of that night, I didn't have a sense of victory. I didn't have the fairy tale wedding I had dreamed of. What I had was clarity, painful and bright. I knew what trust looked like when shattered, what betrayal felt like when it came wrapped in familiarity, and what it meant to pick up the pieces while still holding on to the fragments of love that mattered most. Grandpa Harry always says that the worst truths are the ones we live through, and that night was a truth I would carry with me forever. By the time the night ended, the celebration had turned into a kind of subdued vigil. Guests whispered and speculated, some avoiding eye contact with me, unsure where their loyalty should lie. My family, the people who were supposed to support me, were fractured. Daniel had succeeded in twisting the narrative, leaving everyone questioning choices, motives, and allegiances. I remember the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as people left, the clinking of glasses echoing in the nearly empty hall, and the sharp, metallic scent of spilled wine. It all felt surreal, like walking through someone else's nightmare while being painfully aware it was mine. And yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of clarity. My partner reached for my hand, the warmth of their grip reminding me that trust could still exist, even if it had been violated in other ways. The small, quiet smiles from a few friends who saw the truth offered a sliver of solace. I realized then that betrayal doesn't define the entire story. It shapes it, yes, but it doesn't determine the people who endure it. It teaches lessons about the fragility of trust, about the hidden layers of those we love, and about the strength required to move forward without resentment consuming us entirely. That night, lying awake in the dim light of the hotel room, I replayed every interaction, every misstep, every whisper of doubt. I could still smell the mingling scents of flowers and burnt sugar, hear the laughter that had become a memory tinged with bitterness, and feel the touch of hands that had steadied me when everything else faltered. I understood in a painful way that Daniel's actions weren't just about selfishness. They were about fear, envy, and the strange human need to assert control over moments that belong to others. The lesson was raw and unforgettable. Even family, even those closest to us, can harbor darkness, sometimes without ever realizing the devastation they leave in their wake. By the end of that night, I didn't have a sense of victory. I didn't have the fairy tale wedding I had dreamed of. What I had was clarity, painful and bright. I knew what trust looked like when shattered, what betrayal felt like when it came wrapped in familiarity, and what it meant to pick up the pieces while still holding on to the fragments of love that mattered most. Grandpa Harry always says that the worst truths are the ones we live through, and that night was a truth I would carry with me forever. The days after the wedding were quieter than I expected, but the silence was heavy, thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. My family seemed fractured, as if the laughter and celebration that were supposed to follow had been replaced by an invisible wall between us. Every phone call, every visit, carried a subtle weight. My father's clipped tones, my mother's careful avoidance of Daniel, the way my partner kept glancing at me, still hurt, but trying not to show it. I remember the smell of rain on the pavement outside, the cool damp air mixing with the lingering scent of wedding flowers, and it became almost a sensory trigger for the chaos of that day. I thought confronting Daniel might bring some resolution, a chance for apologies or at least an explanation, but when I finally found him, he leaned back on the porch railing, cigarette in hand, the smoke curling lazily into the autumn air. He didn't meet my eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, and I realized he believed it was some minor incident, not a betrayal that had shredded the foundation of my trust. His casual tone made my chest tighten. How could someone see destruction as a minor mishap? The cousins I had grown up with, the ones who used to be my allies, now seemed like strangers. Some had whispered to my parents, others had sent careful, passive-aggressive messages, all taking sides in ways I hadn't expected. The wedding, which was supposed to unite two families, had instead exposed cracks and resentments I hadn't known existed. I remember the tactile sense of the envelope in my hand when I returned a few wedding gifts, the paper rough against my fingers, a small physical reminder that even thoughtful gestures could not repair emotional damage. My partner tried to comfort me, reminding me that what mattered was the commitment we had made, not the chaos surrounding it. And yet, every time I looked around, I felt Daniel's absence and presence simultaneously. Absent in the way he hadn't fulfilled his promises, present in the way his choices had infected every interaction. The emotional landscape was messy, a tangle of love, frustration, and anger. I understood then, in a new and bitter way, that some betrayals aren't about revenge or malice, they're about ego, about the quiet, corrosive need to assert oneself at the cost of someone else's happiness. One night, as the rain tapped lightly against the windows, I found myself replaying the small moments, trying to piece together why someone would do this. The way he had smiled when giving me the checklist, the way he had reassured me about the florist and photographer, and then the subtle manipulations that spiraled into chaos. I remembered the smell of my partner's perfume, mingling with the scent of the wet garden outside, and the way our hands had squeezed together, both of us understanding that some things, once broken, leave scars even if we try to move forward. It wasn't just the wedding that suffered, it was the way our family now viewed each other. Conversations became cautious, greetings stiff. Even minor gatherings carried the weight of unspoken accusations. Daniel's actions, whether intentional or born from a jealous insecurity, had altered relationships permanently. I realized that betrayal doesn't just harm the immediate target. It ripples outward, changing dynamics, trust, and loyalties in ways that are often irreversible. The tactile memory of the misplaced rings, cold and metallic against my palm, became a metaphor for the lingering chill between family members. And yet, amidst all this, there were quiet moments of reflection. I remembered Grandpa Harry's old words. The worst betrayals teach you what's truly yours and what you must let go. I had learned that trust can be rebuilt, but not without acknowledging the damage done. I could feel the warmth of my partner's hand in mine, the gentle pressure a reminder that while Daniel had stolen a day, he couldn't touch the life we were building together. The emotional victory wasn't dramatic or public. It was intimate, quiet, and deeply personal. By the end of that week, I began making small choices to reclaim control over my life and relationships. I reached out to friends, to family members who had been caught in the middle, and tried to repair the threads that hadn't completely frayed. Some connections were easy, some impossible. Daniel remained distant, his presence a ghostly echo in family gatherings. And though I didn't wish him harm, I understood that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Not fully, not without cost. Through it all, I discovered that betrayal leaves a texture on your life, a sensory imprint that shapes every memory. The smell of rain on the pavement, the texture of the wedding dress against my skin, the faint tang of candle wax in the hall, they became reminders that even in the most beautiful settings, human flaws can twist the narrative. And yet, these same moments taught resilience, a quiet endurance that doesn't make the pain disappear, but allows you to move forward without carrying bitterness as a permanent companion. I spent that week reflecting, writing, and simply being. I understood that life isn't fair, and family isn't always a source of comfort. Sometimes it's the source of our deepest lessons. I smelled the faint incense from the church where we had been married, a scent that now felt bittersweet, carrying both the memory of joy and the sting of betrayal. And I knew deep down that this story wasn't just about a ruined wedding. It was about trust, love, and the often messy intersection between the two. Weeks turned into months, and the dust from that chaotic wedding slowly settled, but it never quite disappeared. Family gatherings became exercises in careful conversation, polite smiles hiding the undercurrent of old wounds. Daniel rarely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped, neutral, like someone trying to erase a memory without admitting it existed. I remember the smell of autumn leaves on the path to my parents' house, the crisp air mixing with the faint perfume of my partner, and it felt like walking through the remnants of a fire. Everything was still standing, but some of it would never be the same. I tried, quietly, to reclaim the joy of that day, the part that belonged to us and not to Daniel's ego. We hung the few wedding photos that survived his interference, the images slightly off-kilter but still beautiful in their imperfection. The laughter of friends and family who truly cared became the anchor, grounding us in a reality where love and trust could still thrive despite one person's betrayal. I realized that the day hadn't been ruined entirely. It had simply taken on a new shape, one that included lessons I wouldn't have learned otherwise. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out old boxes in the attic, I stumbled across a faded wedding invitation. The scent of aged paper and dust brought back the day vividly. The flowers, the burnt sugar, the tension thick in the hall. I touched the paper and smiled wryly, thinking of Grandpa Harry's old saying, "Life will hand you chaos, but it's up to you what you build with it." That's when I truly understood that Daniel's betrayal, as painful and personal as it had been, wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter, a messy, vivid, unforgettable chapter, but not the book itself. I reached out to a few relatives in the weeks that followed, mending bridges where I could, letting go of relationships that had turned toxic, and reinforcing the bonds that mattered most. I smelled fresh coffee each morning with a sense of calm I hadn't felt since the wedding. Small acts of kindness, shared laughter, and quiet evenings with my partner reminded me that, even after betrayal, life had a way of offering small, persistent victories. Daniel's choices had taken a lot, but they couldn't touch the parts of me that I had built from patience, love, and resilience. There were moments of reflection that were harder. I thought about all the times I had trusted him as a child, the shared secrets, the games, the laughter. How had it come to this? And yet, even in that disappointment, I found a strange clarity. People, even family, are complicated. Their flaws, their insecurities, their selfishness, they're part of the reality we live in. Understanding this doesn't make betrayal easier to bear, but it does give it context, a framework for moving forward without being consumed by bitterness. By the time our first anniversary approached, I felt a quiet triumph. Not over Daniel, he wasn't worth the fight, but over the resilience we had cultivated as a couple. The rings that had been misplaced, the chaos that had erupted, the whispered conversations and cautious glances from family, all of it had tested us, forged us into something stronger. I smelled the fresh flowers my partner had bought to commemorate the day, the soft linen of our anniversary table, and I realized that life's beauty often comes wrapped in imperfection, in scars that remind us of what we survived. Grandpa Harry always says that the truth is both merciless and wise. Betrayal can cut deep, but it can also reveal the parts of yourself that are unshakable, the bonds that matter, and the perspective that shapes the rest of your life. That wedding taught me all of that and more. I learned that holding on to anger is like holding on to hot ashes. You burn yourself long after the fire is gone. Let go, rebuild, and treasure what remains. So, if you ever find yourself betrayed by someone you thought you knew, remember this. The day might feel ruined, the trust broken, and the chaos overwhelming. But the life beyond that moment is yours to shape. Lean on those who truly care. Nurture the bonds that survive and never underestimate the quiet strength that grows when you refuse to let bitterness take root. Our next story, it's about a betrayal far quieter, but no less devastating. A lesson in patience, perception, and the hidden truths within a family. Stick around, because Grandpa Harry has a lot more to teach, and I promise you won't see the next twist coming. Life is messy, yes, but it's also ours to navigate with honesty, warmth, and a stubborn little spark of hope that refuses to die.